Timeline. The Cold War. The Cold War was one of the most important and tense periods in modern history. It lasted from approximately 1947 to 1991 and shaped global politics, economics, science, culture, and military strategy for nearly half a century. The conflict developed after World War II, when two former allies, the United States and the Soviet Union, emerged as the world's two superpowers. Causes of the Cold War. After World War II ended in 1945, Europe was devastated. The Soviet Union controlled much of Eastern Europe, while the United States supported rebuilding Western Europe through economic aid and democratic governments. The main cause of tension was ideology. The United States promoted capitalism, private property, and democratic elections. Both sides feared the expansion of the other's system. This mutual distrust led to competition and confrontation. Early Cold War, 1945 to 1953, 1947 Truman Doctrine. The United States announced the Truman Doctrine, promising to support countries resisting communism. 1948–1949 Berlin Blockade and Airlift. The Soviet Union blocked access to West Berlin. In response, the United States and its allies organized the Berlin Airlift, flying supplies into the city for almost a year. This showed that the conflict could escalate without direct war. 1949 Formation of NATO. The NATO was formed as a military alliance between the United States, Canada, and Western European countries. Members agreed to defend each other if attacked. 1949 Soviet atomic bomb. The Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb. This began the nuclear arms race, as both superpowers rapidly built more powerful weapons. 1950 to 1953 Korean War. The Korean War began when North Korea, supported by the Soviet Union and China, invaded South Korea, supported by the United States and United Nations forces. The war ended in a stalemate, but Korea remained divided. Height of tension, 1953 to 1962, arms race and nuclear fear. Both superpowers developed hydrogen bombs and intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. The idea of mutually assured destruction, MAD, meant that nuclear war would destroy both sides. 1955 Warsaw Pact. The Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact as a response to NATO. This formalized the division of Europe into two military blocs. 1957 Space race begins. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite. This shocked the United States and started the space race. 1961 Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall was built to stop East Germans from fleeing to West Berlin. It became a powerful symbol of the Cold War division. 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the world came to nuclear war. The Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, and the United States demanded their removal. After tense negotiations, the crisis ended peacefully, but it demonstrated how dangerous the Cold War had become. Détente, 1960s–1970s. Détente was a period of reduced tension between the superpowers. Arms control agreements. The Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, limited certain nuclear weapons. Both sides recognized that nuclear war would be catastrophic. Vietnam War. The Vietnam War became another major Cold War conflict. The United States supported South Vietnam against Communist North Vietnam. The war deeply divided American society and ended with a communist victory. Renewed tension, 1979 to 1985. 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to support a communist government. The United States supported Afghan resistance fighters. This war weakened the Soviet Union economically and politically. Nuclear buildup. Both sides increased military spending. The arms race intensified again during the early 1980s. The end of the Cold War, 1985 to 1991. Gorbachev's reforms. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became leader of the Soviet Union. He introduced reforms: glasnost, openness, perestroika, restructuring. These reforms unintentionally weakened Soviet control. 1989 Fall of the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989, symbolizing the collapse of communist control in Eastern Europe. 1991 Collapse of the Soviet Union. In 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. This marked the end of the Cold War and left the United States as the only global superpower. Impact of the Cold War. The Cold War divided Europe for decades, created the threat of nuclear destruction, led to proxy wars in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, encouraged technological advances, especially in space exploration, influenced global politics even after 1991. The Cold War was not just a military conflict, but a struggle of ideas, power, and influence that shaped the modern world. 1947 to 1991, a period of tension. From 1947 to 1991, the world experienced one of the most intense and dangerous periods in modern history, the Cold War. This was not a traditional war with constant battles between two armies. Instead, it was a long, global struggle for power, influence, and ideology between the United States and the Soviet Union. Although these two superpowers never directly fought each other in a full-scale military conflict, the tension between them affected nearly every continent. The world was divided into two opposing camps, each led by one of the superpowers. Smaller nations were often forced to choose sides, and many regional conflicts became part of this larger global rivalry. Ideological conflict. At the heart of the Cold War was a deep ideological difference. The United States supported capitalism, private property, free market economy, democratic elections, individual freedoms. The Soviet Union supported communism, state control of the economy, one-party political system, collective ownership. Each side believed its system was superior and feared the spread of the other's ideology. This fear created suspicion, propaganda campaigns, political pressure, and constant competition. Division of the world. After World War II, Europe became divided into two parts: Western Europe, supported by the United States; Eastern Europe, controlled by the Soviet Union. This division became known as the Iron Curtain. Countries in Eastern Europe had communist governments aligned with Moscow, while Western Europe developed democratic governments supported by American economic aid. In 1949, the Western Alliance formed NATO, a military pact promising collective defense. In response, the Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact in 1955. Europe was now militarily and politically split. One of the strongest symbols of this division was the Berlin Wall, built in 1961 to separate East and West Berlin. Families were divided overnight, and it became a visible representation of Cold War tension. Nuclear arms race. One of the most frightening aspects of this period was the nuclear arms race. Both superpowers rapidly developed nuclear weapons, hydrogen bombs, and long-range missiles. The idea of mutually assured destruction, MAD, meant that if one side launched nuclear weapons, the other would respond, leading to total destruction on both sides. The world came closest to nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. When the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, the United States responded with a naval blockade. For 13 days, the world feared global nuclear war. Eventually, both sides reached a compromise, but the crisis showed how dangerous the tension had become. Proxy wars. Although the United States and the Soviet Union avoided direct war, they supported opposing sides in regional conflicts around the world. These conflicts are known as proxy wars. Examples include the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, 1979. In these wars, local conflicts were influenced by the larger struggle between capitalism and communism. Millions of people died in these indirect confrontations. Space race and competition. The Cold War was not only about weapons and wars, it was also about technology and prestige. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite. This shocked the United States and began the space race. In 1969, the United States landed astronauts on the Moon during the Apollo 11 moon landing mission. This achievement became a symbolic victory in the technological competition between the superpowers. Daily life under tension. For ordinary people, the Cold War meant constant fear of nuclear war. In schools, children practiced duck and cover drills. Governments built bomb shelters. Movies and media reflected anxiety about spies, invasion, and atomic disaster. Propaganda was widespread. Each side portrayed the other as dangerous and aggressive. Espionage agencies like the CIA and KGB conducted secret operations around the world. The end of the period. By the 1980s, the Soviet economy was struggling. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became leader of the Soviet Union and introduced reforms called glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. These changes weakened strict government control. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Communist governments in Eastern Europe collapsed one by one. Finally, in 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. The Cold War officially ended, closing a chapter of nearly 45 years of global tension. Overview: The Cold War, 1947 to 1991. The Cold War was a long period of intense political, military, and ideological tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. It began after World War II and lasted until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Unlike traditional wars, the Cold War did not involve direct large-scale military fighting between the two superpowers. Instead, it was a global rivalry built on ideological conflict, nuclear competition, economic influence, propaganda, espionage, and proxy wars. The tension shaped international relations for nearly half a century and affected billions of people worldwide. Democracy versus communism. At the center of the Cold War was a deep ideological struggle. The United States and democracy. The United States promoted democracy, free elections and multiple political parties, capitalism, private ownership and free market economy, individual rights and freedoms. Freedom of speech and religion. American leaders believed that democracy created prosperity, political stability, and personal freedom. They feared that the spread of communism would threaten global security and economic systems. The Soviet Union and communism. The Soviet Union supported communism, state ownership of property and industry, a one-party political system, centralized economic planning, collective control over resources. Soviet leaders believed capitalism exploited workers and created inequality. They saw communism as a fairer system that would eliminate class differences. Both sides believed their system was superior. This belief created distrust and competition that defined the entire Cold War. Not a direct war. Although the United States and the Soviet Union were rivals, they avoided direct military confrontation because both possessed nuclear weapons. A full war between them could have led to global destruction. Instead, they competed in indirect ways, supporting opposing sides in regional conflicts, forming military alliances, conducting intelligence and spy operations, influencing developing countries politically and economically. This type of indirect confrontation made the Cold War dangerous, even without direct battle. The arms race. One of the most frightening aspects of the Cold War was the nuclear arms race. After the United States used atomic bombs in 1945, the Soviet Union quickly developed its own nuclear weapons. Both countries then began building more powerful hydrogen bombs and long-range missiles. The concept of mutually assured destruction, MAD, meant that if one side launched a nuclear attack, the other would respond, and both would be destroyed. This balance of terror prevented direct war but created constant fear. The world came closest to nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Soviet missiles were discovered in Cuba. For several days, the world feared a nuclear catastrophe before a diplomatic solution was reached. Global influence and proxy wars. The Cold War was global. Countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East became arenas for competition. Major proxy conflicts included the Korean War, The Vietnam War, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. In these wars, local disputes were connected to the larger struggle between capitalism and communism. Millions of people were affected by these conflicts. Division of Europe. After World War II, Europe was divided into two blocks. Western Europe aligned with the United States and formed NATO in 1949. Eastern Europe fell under Soviet influence and later formed the Warsaw Pact in 1955. The division became physically visible in 1961 with the construction of the Berlin Wall, which separated East and West Berlin. It became a symbol of Cold War division and ideological conflict. The space race. Competition extended beyond Earth. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite. This began the space race. In 1969, the United States achieved a major victory when astronauts landed on the Moon during the Apollo 11 moon landing mission. Technological achievements became a way to demonstrate national superiority. Daily life during the Cold War. The Cold War influenced everyday life, nuclear drills in schools, fear of atomic war, propaganda campaigns, spy scandals, political suspicion. The end of the Cold War. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union faced serious economic problems. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev introduced reforms called glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. These reforms weakened strict government control. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Communist governments across Eastern Europe collapsed. Finally, in 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, officially ending the Cold War. Capitalism versus communism, a clash of systems, lifestyles, and values. During the Cold War, the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union was not only about power and military strength. It was a deep ideological struggle between two completely different political, economic, and social systems, capitalism and communism. This conflict went far beyond politics. It influenced everyday life, culture, education, work, freedom, and even personal identity. Each side believed its system represented the best future for humanity. Capitalism, USA. Capitalism in the United States was built on several core principles. Private property. Individuals and companies could own businesses, land, and resources. People were free to start their own companies, invest money, and compete in the marketplace. Profit was seen as motivation for innovation and growth. Free elections. The United States had a multi-party political system. Citizens voted in regular elections and could choose between different political candidates and ideas. Power could change peacefully through voting. Individual freedom. Freedom of speech, religion, press, and assembly were protected. Citizens could openly criticize the government, express opinions, and pursue personal goals. Free market economy. Prices and production were determined mainly by supply and demand. Businesses competed with one another, and consumers had choices in goods and services. American leaders argued that capitalism encouraged creativity, technological progress, and personal responsibility. They believed economic competition led to prosperity and higher living standards. Communism, USSR. Communism in the Soviet Union was based on very different ideas. State ownership. Factories, land, and major industries were owned by the government. Private ownership of large businesses was not allowed. The state controlled production and distribution of goods. One-party rule. The Soviet Union had only one legal political party, the Communist Party. There were no competitive national elections like in the United States. Political opposition was not permitted. Government control. The government played a central role in economic planning. 5-year plans set production goals for industry and agriculture. The state decided what and how much would be produced. Collective ideals. Communism emphasized equality and collective benefit over individual wealth. The goal was to eliminate social classes and reduce economic inequality. Soviet leaders believed capitalism created unfair wealth differences and exploited workers. They saw communism as a system designed to promote fairness and social security. A clash of values. The Cold War was not only about territory or weapons. It was about values, individual freedom versus collective responsibility, political pluralism versus centralized authority, market competition versus economic planning, personal wealth versus economic equality. Both sides used propaganda to present their system as morally superior. Films, newspapers, radio broadcasts, and school education reinforced national ideology. Each side portrayed the other as dangerous and oppressive. Everyday life differences. The ideological clash affected daily life. In the United States, consumer culture expanded. Shopping malls, private cars, and advertising became common. Media was diverse and privately owned. In the Soviet Union, housing, jobs, and education were guaranteed by the state. Consumer goods were more limited. Media was controlled by the government. These differences shaped how people lived, worked, and viewed the world. More than politics, the Cold War was more than diplomacy and military tension. It was a competition of lifestyles and belief systems. Both superpowers tried to prove that their model could provide stability, prosperity, and progress. Scientific achievements, such as the space race, military strength, and economic performance were all used as evidence of ideological superiority. In the end, the conflict showed how powerful ideas can shape global history. The struggle between capitalism and communism defined international relations for nearly half a century and left a lasting impact on the modern world. Setting: the world after 1945. World War II ended in 1945, leaving much of the world physically destroyed and economically exhausted. Major cities across Europe and Asia were in ruins. Millions of people had died, industries were shattered, transportation systems were damaged, and entire economies had collapsed. The war had dramatically changed the balance of global power. Two countries emerged from the conflict stronger than all others: the United States and the Soviet Union. These nations would soon become the central rivals in what became known as the Cold War. A new global balance of power. Before World War II, European countries such as Britain, France, and Germany had been dominant world powers. After 1945, however, Europe was devastated. Its economies were weak, its political systems unstable, and its infrastructure destroyed. The United States, in contrast, had experienced little physical damage at home. Its industry had expanded during the war, and its economy was booming. It possessed vast financial resources, advanced technology, and, at the time, the world's only atomic weapons. The Soviet Union had suffered enormous losses, millions of deaths and massive destruction, but it emerged with a powerful army and strong political influence over Eastern Europe. The Red Army had liberated, and occupied, many territories from Nazi control, giving the USSR strategic dominance in the region. The world was no longer led by traditional European empires. Instead, it became bipolar, dominated by two superpowers with opposing systems. Europe in ruins. Europe faced enormous challenges. Cities like Berlin and Warsaw were heavily destroyed. Food shortages and homelessness were widespread. Governments were unstable or newly formed. Economies needed complete reconstruction. Rebuilding Europe became a central concern. The United States introduced economic assistance to Western Europe, believing that economic stability would prevent the spread of communism. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, strengthened its political control over Eastern Europe, installing communist governments in countries such as Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. As a result, Europe became divided into two spheres of influence. Western Europe aligned with the United States, and Eastern Europe aligned with the Soviet Union. This division would shape global politics for decades. Competing visions for the future. Both superpowers wanted global influence, but for different reasons. The United States saw itself as the defender of democracy and capitalism. American leaders believed that spreading democratic governments and free market economies would create political stability and prevent future wars. They also wanted open international trade, access to global markets, Political alliances with other democratic nations. Containment of communism. The US feared that poverty and instability in war-torn countries could lead to communist revolutions. The Soviet Union. The Soviet Union focused on security and ideological expansion. Having been invaded twice in the 20th century, World War I and World War II, Soviet leaders wanted a buffer zone of friendly communist states along their western border. They aimed to expand communist influence, strengthen political control in Eastern Europe, prevent Western military threats, compete economically and militarily with the United States. The USSR believed that capitalism was unstable and exploitative. Soviet leaders expected communism to eventually spread worldwide. The beginning of suspicion. Although the United States and the Soviet Union had been allies against Nazi Germany, their alliance was based on necessity rather than trust. Even during the war, tensions existed. After 1945, disagreements over Germany's future, Eastern Europe's governments, and nuclear weapons increased mistrust. Each side began to view the other not as a partner, but as a potential enemy. The United States worried about Soviet expansion into Europe. The Soviet Union feared Western encirclement and hostility. This growing suspicion laid the foundation for decades of rivalry. A world divided. By the late 1940s, the world was clearly dividing into two ideological camps: capitalist democracies led by the United States, communist states led by the Soviet Union. Smaller nations were often pressured to align with one side or the other. This global competition extended beyond Europe to Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The end of World War II did not bring complete peace. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new kind of conflict, one defined not by direct battlefield confrontation between the superpowers, but by tension, competition, and ideological struggle. This post-war setting created the conditions for nearly half a century of global rivalry, shaping politics, economics, and international relations until 1991. Hotspots. Major Cold War conflicts. During the Cold War, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were often expressed through regional crises and wars. These conflicts are known as Cold War hotspots, areas where political rivalry turned into open confrontation, military action, or the threat of nuclear war. Although the two superpowers avoided direct large-scale war against each other, they supported opposing sides in these conflicts. These hotspots became testing grounds for military power, political influence, and ideological dominance. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953. The Korean War was one of the first major military conflicts of the Cold War. After World War II, Korea was divided along the 38th parallel. North Korea was supported by the Soviet Union and later China. South Korea was supported by the United States and the United Nations. In 1950, North Korean forces invaded South Korea in an attempt to unify the peninsula under communism. The United States quickly intervened to stop the spread of communism in Asia. The war was intense and destructive, involving millions of soldiers and civilians. The conflict ended in 1953 with an armistice, not a peace treaty. Korea remains divided today, demonstrating how Cold War tensions created long-lasting global divisions. The Vietnam War, 1955–1975. The Vietnam War became one of the longest and most controversial Cold War conflicts. Vietnam was divided into Communist North Vietnam, supported by the Soviet Union and China, anti-communist South Vietnam, supported by the United States. The United States feared that if Vietnam became communist, other countries in Southeast Asia would follow. This was known as the domino theory. The war involved guerrilla warfare, heavy bombing campaigns, and large numbers of American troops. It caused massive destruction and civilian casualties. In 1975, North Vietnam captured Saigon, and the country was unified under communist control. The Vietnam War deeply affected American society and showed the limits of military power in ideological conflicts. The Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the most dangerous moment of the Cold War. In 1962, the Soviet Union secretly placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the United States. When American surveillance discovered the missiles, President John F. Kennedy announced a naval blockade around Cuba. For 13 tense days, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. Both superpowers prepared for possible military confrontation. A nuclear exchange could have caused global catastrophe. Eventually, a diplomatic agreement was reached. The Soviet Union removed its missiles from Cuba. The United States agreed not to invade Cuba and secretly removed its missiles from Turkey. The crisis demonstrated how quickly Cold War tensions could escalate and how close humanity came to nuclear destruction. Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, 1979. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to support a communist government facing internal rebellion. The conflict became another Cold War hotspot because the United States supported Afghan resistance fighters, the Mujahideen. The war became a prolonged and costly struggle for the Soviet Union. Afghanistan turned into a proxy battlefield where both superpowers competed indirectly. The war lasted nearly a decade and weakened the Soviet economy and military. Many historians consider the Afghan War one of the factors that contributed to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Why these hotspots matter? These conflicts were not isolated events. They were connected to the broader struggle between capitalism and communism. Each hotspot represented a test of military strength, a battle for ideological influence, a struggle for regional control, a demonstration of global power. Millions of people died in these conflicts, even though the two superpowers never fought each other directly. A global pattern of tension. Cold War hotspots were not limited to these four examples. Similar tensions appeared in Latin America, the Middle East, Africa. In each region, local political struggles became part of the larger global rivalry. Conclusion. The Cold War was cold only between the superpowers themselves. In many parts of the world, it was very real and very violent. Hotspots like Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, and Afghanistan show how ideological rivalry turned into armed conflict, shaping international relations for decades and leaving lasting political and social consequences that are still visible today. Arms race, nuclear competition and the balance of fear. During the Cold War, the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union was not fought through direct battles between their armies. Instead, one of the most intense and dangerous forms of competition was the nuclear arms race, a race to build more powerful, more advanced, and more numerous nuclear weapons than the opponent. This competition created a global atmosphere of fear. The world lived under the constant possibility that a single decision could trigger total destruction. The beginning of the nuclear age. In 1945, at the end of World War II, the United States became the first country to develop and use atomic weapons. At that moment, it held a nuclear monopoly. However, this situation did not last long. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its own atomic bomb. From that point forward, both superpowers entered a race to increase their nuclear capabilities. Each side believed that military strength guaranteed national security. Neither wanted to appear weaker than the other. Escalation. From atomic bombs to hydrogen bombs. The arms race quickly escalated. Early atomic bombs were already devastating. In the 1950s, both sides developed hydrogen bombs, which were far more powerful. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, were created, capable of delivering nuclear warheads across continents in minutes. Submarines equipped with nuclear missiles were deployed underwater, making second strike attacks possible. Technology advanced rapidly. Each new development increased destructive potential. The goal was not simply defense, it was deterrence through overwhelming power. Mutually assured destruction, MAD. One of the central concepts of the nuclear arms race was mutually assured destruction, MAD. MAD was the idea that, if the United States launched a nuclear attack on the Soviet Union would respond with its own nuclear strike. Both countries would suffer catastrophic destruction. This meant that nuclear war would not produce a winner. Both sides would be destroyed. Paradoxically, this terrifying reality helped prevent direct war. Because both superpowers knew the consequences, they were discouraged from launching a first strike. The balance of fear created a fragile form of stability known as nuclear deterrence. Living under the nuclear threat, the arms race affected daily life around the world. In the United States, schools conducted duck and cover drills. Bomb shelters were built in homes and public spaces. Movies and media often focused on nuclear disaster scenarios. In the Soviet Union, civil defense programs trained citizens for emergency situations. Government propaganda emphasized military strength and preparedness. The constant possibility of nuclear war created anxiety and psychological tension that defined the Cold War generation. The Cuban Missile Crisis, peak of the arms race. The nuclear competition reached its most dangerous moment during the Cuban Missile Crisis. When the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, close to American territory, the United States responded with a naval blockade. For 13 days, the world stood on the edge of nuclear war. This crisis demonstrated how the arms race could quickly spiral into potential catastrophe. Afterward, both sides recognized the need for communication and began establishing direct diplomatic channels. Attempts to control the arms race. Although competition continued, both superpowers realized that unlimited nuclear expansion was unsustainable and dangerous. Several arms control agreements were introduced to limit weapons production and testing. These agreements did not end the rivalry, but they reduced some of the risks associated with nuclear escalation. The arms race shifted from rapid expansion to controlled management, though tension never fully disappeared. Why the arms race mattered. The nuclear arms race shaped global politics in several ways. It prevented direct war between the superpowers. It increased military spending dramatically. It influenced scientific research and technological innovation. It created global fear and political instability. Countries around the world were affected by nuclear strategies, alliances, and military planning. Conclusion. The nuclear arms race was one of the most defining aspects of the Cold War. It was a competition not to fight, but to deter fighting through overwhelming destructive power. Mutually assured destruction created a strange and dangerous balance, peace maintained by fear. While it prevented direct war between the United States and the Soviet Union, it placed the world under the constant shadow of nuclear annihilation. The legacy of the arms race continues to influence global security policies even today. The space race was not simply a technological contest, it was a dramatic and deeply symbolic struggle for global leadership during the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union were competing not only for military power, but also for prestige, influence, and ideological dominance. Space became the ultimate arena because it represented the future. Whoever controlled space would appear more advanced, more intelligent, and more powerful. After World War II, both nations captured German rocket scientists, including engineers who had developed the V-2 rocket. In the Soviet Union, Sergei Korolev became the chief designer of the Soviet space program. In the United States, Wernher von Braun played a key role in developing American rockets. Their work laid the foundation for the space race. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1 in October 1957, the world was stunned. It was a small metal sphere, but its political impact was enormous. Americans feared a missile gap, believing the USSR was far ahead in military rocket technology. The launch led to major reforms in the U.S. education system, especially in math and science. It also directly resulted in the creation of NASA in 1958. The Soviets continued to dominate the early years. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth aboard Vostok 1, becoming the first human in space. This achievement was celebrated across the communist world and strengthened the global image of Soviet scientific superiority. The United States answered with its Mercury program, sending astronauts into space and gradually improving its capabilities. President John F. Kennedy understood that America needed a dramatic goal to regain leadership. In 1961, he announced that the U.S. would land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the decade ended. This became the Apollo program, one of the most ambitious projects in human history. It required the development of massive Saturn V rockets, advanced computers, lunar modules, and new navigation systems. The competition was extremely dangerous. In 1967, 3 American astronauts died in the Apollo 1 fire during a ground test. The Soviet program also experienced fatal accidents, though many details were kept secret at the time. Despite setbacks, both nations pushed forward. The turning point came in July 1969 with Apollo 11. Astronaut Neil Armstrong became the first person to step onto the moon, followed by Buzz Aldrin, while Michael Collins remained in lunar orbit. This moment symbolized an American victory in the space race. Millions of people around the world watched the event live on television. It was not only a scientific success but also a powerful political message. However, the space race was not purely about propaganda. It led to revolutionary technological progress. The need to miniaturize computers for spacecraft accelerated the development of modern computing. Satellite technology improved global communication and weather forecasting. Materials designed for space exploration later influenced medicine, transportation, and consumer electronics. The rivalry also influenced culture. Space became part of movies, literature, fashion, and education. Children grew up dreaming of becoming astronauts or cosmonauts. Science fiction flourished. The idea of exploring Mars and beyond became part of the global imagination. Interestingly, by the mid-1970s, competition slowly transformed into cooperation. In 1975, American and Soviet spacecraft docked in orbit during the Apollo-Soyuz mission, symbolizing a temporary easing of Cold War tensions. Decades later, former rivals would work together on the International Space Station. In conclusion, the space race was one of the most important chapters of the Cold War. It combined fear, ambition, innovation, and human courage. It changed education systems, accelerated technological progress, and reshaped global politics. Most importantly, it expanded humanity's understanding of what was possible, proving that humans could leave Earth, travel through space, and walk on another world. During the Cold War was shaped by constant tension, uncertainty, and fear. It was not a traditional war with continuous fighting between the United States and the Soviet Union. Instead, it was a conflict built on political rivalry, nuclear threats, espionage, and ideological competition. Even though many people lived ordinary daily lives, going to school, working, celebrating holidays, there was always a background anxiety that a nuclear war could begin at any moment. One of the most frightening aspects of daily life was the threat of nuclear weapons. After the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, the world understood how destructive nuclear weapons could be. When both superpowers built thousands of nuclear warheads, the fear became global. Children in the United States and other Western countries practiced duck and cover drills at school. During these drills, students hid under desks or against walls in case of a nuclear attack. Although these exercises were meant to prepare and protect them, many people later admitted that they increased anxiety rather than reducing it. The idea that a single missile could destroy an entire city was terrifying. This fear intensified during major crises such as the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1962, the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, very close to the United States. For 13 days, the world stood on the edge of nuclear war. Families followed news reports closely, unsure whether war would break out. Some people even built bomb shelters in their backyards. When the crisis ended peacefully, it brought relief, but it also showed how close humanity had come to disaster. Another major feature of Cold War life was the fear of spies and betrayal. Both sides used intelligence agencies to gather secrets and monitor enemies. In the United States, the CIA worked to counter Soviet influence, while in the Soviet Union the KGB carried out surveillance and espionage. Ordinary citizens sometimes feared being accused of supporting the enemy. In America, this fear became extreme during the period known as McCarthyism, when people were accused of being communists without strong evidence. Careers were destroyed, and trust between neighbors weakened. In the Soviet Union, strict government control meant that criticizing the system could result in punishment, imprisonment, or worse. Germany became one of the most visible symbols of Cold War division. After World War II, Germany was split into East and West. In 1961, the Berlin Wall was built to separate East Berlin from West Berlin. Families were suddenly divided overnight. People who lived on one side could no longer easily visit relatives or friends on the other. The wall became a powerful symbol of ideological separation, capitalism in the West and communism in the East. Guards, barbed wire, and watchtowers made crossing extremely dangerous. Some people risked their lives trying to escape from east to west. Propaganda was another powerful force shaping daily life. Both governments used media, films, posters, and school textbooks to promote their political systems and criticize the enemy. In the United States, communism was often portrayed as dangerous and oppressive. In the Soviet Union, capitalism was described as greedy and unjust. Citizens were encouraged to feel patriotic and loyal. Sporting events, scientific achievements, and even cultural performances became political symbols. For example, success in the Olympics or in the space race was treated as proof of national superiority. The Cold War also influenced culture and entertainment. Movies, books, and television shows often reflected fears of invasion or nuclear destruction. Science fiction became especially popular, exploring themes of alien threats, advanced technology, and apocalyptic futures. Music and art sometimes carried hidden political messages. Even fashion and consumer goods became part of the competition. Western countries highlighted economic abundance, while the Soviet Union emphasized collective strength and equality. Economically, life differed significantly depending on where someone lived. In Western capitalist countries, consumer culture expanded. Supermarkets, cars, televisions, and fall of the wall, a turning point in world history. The fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989, was one of the most dramatic and emotional moments of the 20th century. It symbolized not only the end of division in Germany but also the beginning of the end of the Cold War. For nearly 3 decades, the wall had stood as a powerful reminder of conflict between East and West, communism and capitalism, and the Soviet Union and the United States. Why the wall was built? After World War II, Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones controlled by the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Over time, political differences between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union grew stronger. In 1949, 2 separate countries were officially formed, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, and the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. Berlin, although located deep inside East Germany, was also divided into East and West. West Berlin became a symbol of freedom and economic success. Meanwhile, East Germany struggled with economic problems and political restrictions under a communist system. Between 1949 and 1961, about 2.7 million people left East Germany for the West. Many were young, educated professionals. This created serious economic problems for the East German government. To stop this brain drain, the government built the Berlin Wall in August 1961. Almost overnight, streets were blocked, barbed wire was installed, and later a concrete wall replaced it. Families were separated instantly. The wall was not just a simple barrier. It included guard towers, floodlights, armed soldiers, and a death strip between 2 walls. Anyone who tried to escape risked arrest or death. The wall became a global symbol of oppression and lack of freedom. Life with the wall. For 28 years, the wall shaped daily life in Berlin. People in East Berlin lived under strict government control. Travel to Western countries was extremely limited. The government monitored citizens closely, and secret police, the Stasi, watched for any sign of opposition. In West Berlin, life was very different. The city received economic support from Western countries and became a symbol of democracy and opportunity. The contrast between the two sides of the city made the division even more obvious. World leaders often spoke about the wall as a symbol of Cold War tension. In 1987, US President Ronald Reagan famously stood near the wall and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." His speech reflected growing global pressure for change. Changes in the 1980s. In the 1980s, major changes began in the Soviet Union under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev. He introduced reforms called glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. These reforms allowed more freedom of speech and attempted to improve the struggling Soviet economy. Importantly, Gorbachev made it clear that the Soviet Union would no longer use military force to control Eastern European countries as it had in the past. Inspired by these changes, people in Eastern Europe began demanding more rights and freedoms. In 1989, peaceful protests spread across East Germany. Thousands of people gathered in cities like Leipzig, calling for free elections and the right to travel. The protests grew larger every week. The government began losing control. The night the wall fell, on November 9, 1989, an East German official held a press conference to announce new travel regulations. Due to confusion and poor communication, he stated that East Germans could travel freely to the West, immediately. The news spread quickly. Thousands of people went to the border crossings, demanding to pass through. The border guards had not received clear instructions. Faced with massive crowds and no clear orders, they eventually opened the checkpoints. People crossed freely for the first time in decades. Scenes of celebration followed. Strangers hugged, families reunited, and crowds climbed onto the wall. Some used hammers and chisels to break pieces off as souvenirs. Television broadcast the images worldwide. It was a moment of joy, relief, and historical change. After the fall of the wall led quickly to German reunification. On October 3, 1990, East and West Germany officially became one country again. This reunification was peaceful and supported by major world powers. The collapse of communist governments continued across Eastern Europe. In 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolved into independent republics. This marked the official end of the Cold War. Why it matters. The fall of the Berlin Wall was important not only for Germany but for the entire world. It showed that peaceful protests and public pressure could bring change even in strict political systems. It symbolized the victory of unity over division and freedom over control. Understanding the Cold War is essential for understanding today's global challenges because many modern political tensions, military strategies, alliances, and even technological systems were shaped during that period. The Cold War was not simply a rivalry between two countries, it was a global ideological struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union that lasted from about 1947 to 1991. Although it ended decades ago, its legacy continues to influence international relations in powerful and sometimes dangerous ways. One of the clearest examples of the Cold War's legacy is the tension between NATO and modern Russia. NATO was created in 1949 as a military alliance designed to prevent the spread of Soviet influence in Europe. It united Western countries under a collective defense agreement. If one member was attacked, all would respond. This alliance was directly connected to the fear of Soviet expansion. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, many expected tensions to decrease permanently. However, NATO did not dissolve. Instead, it expanded eastward, including countries that had once been part of the Soviet sphere of influence. From Russia's perspective, this expansion appears threatening, as NATO military infrastructure moved closer to its borders. This historical background helps explain why relations between Russia and Western countries remain tense today. Without understanding Cold War history, modern conflicts in Eastern Europe can seem sudden or confusing. Another major legacy of the Cold War is the system of global alliances and regional conflicts that were influenced by superpower competition. During the Cold War, The United States and the Soviet Union avoided direct military confrontation because of the threat of nuclear war. Instead, they supported opposing sides in conflicts around the world, a strategy known as proxy warfare. In Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, local wars often became battlegrounds for global ideological rivalry. Governments were supported or overthrown based on whether they aligned with capitalism or communism. These interventions shaped political systems, borders, and power structures that still exist today. In some regions, instability, authoritarian governments, and long-term conflicts can be traced back to Cold War involvement. Understanding these historical connections allows us to better analyze current crises and diplomatic tensions. The Cold War also shaped the structure of world politics. It established a bipolar world system, meaning power was concentrated in two dominant superpowers. Even after the Soviet Union collapsed, the global political order continued to reflect patterns formed during that time. Concepts such as nuclear deterrence, the idea that nuclear weapons prevent war because of the fear of mutual destruction, remain central to international security strategies. Countries continue to invest heavily in military alliances, defense systems, and strategic deterrence policies based on Cold War thinking. The idea of balancing power between major nations is still a key principle in global diplomacy. Technology is another area where the Cold War's influence is clearly visible. The intense competition between the superpowers led to rapid scientific advancement. The space race pushed both sides to develop rockets, satellites, and space exploration technologies. Military research led to innovations in computing, communications, and defense systems. Early computer networks developed for military purposes eventually contributed to the creation of the modern Internet. Satellite systems originally designed for strategic purposes now support navigation, communication, and global media. Even artificial intelligence and cybersecurity strategies today are shaped by patterns of technological competition that began during the Cold War. Culturally and socially, the Cold War shaped global perspectives on freedom, democracy, security, and government power. Propaganda, media narratives, and political messaging influenced how people viewed capitalism and communism. Films, literature, and television frequently explored themes of espionage, nuclear fear, and ideological struggle. Entire generations grew up practicing nuclear drills in schools, fearing global destruction. This atmosphere of anxiety influenced education, public policy, and even architecture, such as the construction of bomb shelters. The psychological impact of living under constant threat helped shape modern discussions about national security and global responsibility. Quiz. Check your understanding of the Cold War. Now that we have studied the causes, major events, and legacy of the Cold War, it is important to review and reflect on the key ideas. The following questions are designed to help you think critically about what you have learned. Take your time, and try to answer in complete sentences using historical details and examples. Do not just write one word. Explain your thinking clearly. The Cold War was a long period of political tension, ideological rivalry, military competition, and global influence between two powerful nations. It affected nearly every continent and shaped modern international relations. To make sure you fully understand its meaning and importance, consider the following review questions. What is a proxy war? Explain what this term means and why proxy wars were important during the Cold War period. Think about how powerful countries competed without directly fighting each other. Who were the two main Cold War superpowers? Describe their political systems and explain why they were considered superpowers. What made them so influential globally? What event symbolized the end of the Cold War? Why was this event so significant? How did it change global politics and international relations? As you answer, try to connect your responses to larger themes such as ideological conflict, military alliances, nuclear tension, and global power balance. These questions will help you strengthen your understanding and prepare for deeper discussions or written assignments about the Cold War. Finally, The Cold War was not simply a war between two powerful countries, it was a global transformation that reshaped politics, borders, alliances, economies, and even the way people think about power and security. Unlike traditional wars fought with direct battles and clear endings, the Cold War was a long period of tension, competition, and ideological struggle that changed the structure of the entire world. Its consequences were not temporary, they permanently altered international relations and the global balance of power. The Cold War created a new kind of global system built around two opposing superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Countries around the world were pressured to choose sides, aligning themselves either with Western capitalist democracies or with communist governments influenced by Moscow. This division formed powerful military and political alliances that still exist today. Organizations such as NATO were established to defend against perceived threats, and many of these alliances continue to shape diplomatic and military strategies in the modern world. The structure of collective defense, where countries promise to protect one another, became a central feature of global security. The Cold War also changed the world map in dramatic ways. Europe was physically and politically divided for decades. Germany was split into East and West, symbolizing the broader global divide. When the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, new independent countries emerged across Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Borders shifted, governments changed, and entirely new national identities formed. The breakup of the Soviet Union alone created 15 new states. These changes continue to influence regional politics, economic development, and international relationships today. In addition to redrawing borders, the Cold War left behind unresolved conflicts. Because the United States and the Soviet Union competed indirectly through proxy wars, many regions experienced violence that had long-term consequences. Governments were supported or overthrown based on ideology rather than stability, and some countries still struggle with political instability rooted in Cold War interventions. Modern conflicts in parts of Eastern Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia often have historical connections to Cold War rivalries and power struggles. Another major transformation was in military strategy and global security thinking. The development of nuclear weapons introduced the concept of mutually assured destruction, the idea that a nuclear war would destroy both sides completely. This created a tense but stable balance of fear. Even today, nuclear deterrence remains a central part of international security policy. Military budgets, defense systems, and diplomatic negotiations continue to reflect strategies first developed during the Cold War era. Technological progress during this period also permanently changed the world. The competition between superpowers accelerated advancements in space exploration, engineering, and communication systems. Satellites, rocket technology, early computer networks, and advanced research programs were developed because of Cold War rivalry. Many of the technologies that define modern life, global communication networks, GPS systems, and space-based infrastructure, have roots in this period of intense competition. The Cold War also transformed global culture and psychology. Entire generations grew up under the shadow of potential nuclear war. Governments used propaganda to shape public opinion and promote national ideologies. Movies, literature, and media reflected fears of espionage, invasion, and global destruction. This atmosphere influenced education systems, political debates, and even everyday conversations about freedom, democracy, and security. The ideological battle between capitalism and communism shaped how societies defined success, equality, and individual rights. Economically, the Cold War strengthened some nations while weakening others. Countries aligned with one superpower often received financial or military support. This shaped global trade patterns and development paths that still affect the world economy. The collapse of the Soviet system also marked the global rise of market-based economies, influencing economic policies across many former communist states.